the last arcade game in the black box set, and Luigi's first appearance. Up next is Mario Bros. Mario Bros marks an interesting turning point in terms of Nintendo's approach to arcade games. While we've already gone over the history of Mario in the black box set, his past can really be split into two distinct parts, the arcade days and the NES days. Mario the character had first appeared 2 years prior to Mario Bros. As the protagonist in Donkey Kong. He then turned into an abusive pet owner and was the antagonist of Donkey Kong Jr., caging up DK and whipping him relentlessly. It's likely that Nintendo wasn't sure what to do with the character. His namesake and design was already extremely recognizable, but his role was unclear. In Donkey Kong, Mario was officially classified as a carpenter, but Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the directors and designers of Mario Bros., instead insisted on changing his job title to that of a plumber. This, along with his classification as a courageous hero, has stuck ever since. Afterwards, Nintendo started using Mario as a recognizable self-insert into just about everything they could, but that didn't start until later down the road. Mario Bros. Was also the first appearance of the palette-swapped Mario, otherwise known as Luigi, controlled by Player 2. There were no differences between the two characters, but Luigi would become nearly as iconic as his brother, showing up in just about every Mario game to date. Mario Bros. Marked the beginning of the end of Nintendo's arcade era. The Famicom released on July 15, 1983 in Japan, and Mario Bros. Came out in June of the same year. Most of Nintendo's resources were focused on promoting their new system, which ended up becoming a massive success. From then on out, they recalibrated to mainly focus on home consoles in terms of game development and advertising. This isn't to say that Mario Bros. Wasn't popular, though. It was incredibly successful in both America and Japan, even if its advertising campaigns weren't as successful as Nintendo's other arcade games. But it is the last big arcade-exclusive hit that Nintendo is often known for. Mario Bros. Was the second to last arcade game Miyamoto developed, in tandem with Gunpei Yokoi, the same team that made Donkey Kong. The two went back and forth on how to design the gameplay and characters. In Donkey Kong, Mario isn't able to fall further than he is tall without dying. Miyamoto wanted this to remain a hard and fast rule, but Yokoi recommended giving Mario some superhuman abilities in order to make the player feel more powerful. The idea to implement combat was put forth by Yokoi as well, who recommended hitting enemies from below to knock them out. This ended up being too simple though. Instead, the team settled on each enemy requiring a minimum of 2 hits, at least one from below, and then a kick from the side, in order to defeat a foe. Turtles, also known as shell creepers, were conceived as the perfect enemy, as the first hit from below would knock them onto their shells, and the second would send them flying. These weren't the same species as Koopas, which would appear in Super Mario Bros., but it was the first time that Mario faced off against reptiles. A couple of other enemy types also graced these sewers in later levels. Crabs were a bit tougher than turtles. On the first punch, they'd speed up out of anger. One more hit is required to take them out. Fighter flies moved slowly but would jump, requiring good timing to knock them off their feet. Slip ices turned entire stretches of platform icy, making running more difficult, but were defeated by a single hit. While the strategies for defeating these enemies weren't all that complex, Mario Bros. Made use of impressive physics to deepen the gameplay. The ripples that appear on the floor when Mario jumps determine which direction an enemy gets launched. If Mario jumps up to attack an enemy from behind, they move forward, while if he jumps from ahead, they get sent backwards. These physics were intuitive and added a whole new level to the game. They made precise jumps necessary to beat later stages, as hitting foes down to the player's own level was the only way to deal with the sheer numbers that would appear. It also encouraged players to plan their attacks, as lining up and kicking a row of Koopas would reward extra points and the chance at a bonus round. Speaking of physics though, let's talk about Mario's jump for a moment. Mario Bros.' jump is much floatier than Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr.'s, which does make stylistic sense. Mario is no longer bound to reality. He was specifically designed to feel more super than human, although this moniker wouldn't stick until a couple of years later. However, the actual physics of the left-right jump movement remain relatively unchanged. Mario's momentum is determined the second he leaves the ground, and cannot be altered mid-air. At the time, this was standard, but if you've played nearly any modern platformer and then go to Mario Bros., it does feel awkward. Ascending platforms that are directly above Mario is the biggest challenge in the game. A running jump is required, which leaves you vulnerable to enemies while building up speed, especially in later stages. This difficulty is exacerbated by the presence of fireballs, another classic enemy that made its debut in this arcade game. They spawn in and move from right to left, forcing the player who may be lingering in a certain row to move around. They're actually destructible and can be eliminated the same way as all other enemy types, by hitting them from below, but doing so is often more trouble than it's worth. Ultimately, Mario Bros. Was a step both forwards and backwards from Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. Many arcade games from the late 70s and early 80s were focused on clearing a board, and as we discussed in the Donkey Kong Trilogy section, these games broke from that standard. Mario Bros. Returned to it. Well, it didn't entirely return to it. There was one presence that made each stage feel like a continuation of the last: the POW block. Jumping into it functioned as a hit on every grounded enemy on screen, giving the player a get-out-of-jail-free card of sorts. To balance this, the POW could only be used 3 times in a series of phases, and uses would only be reset upon reaching a bonus round. However, by virtue of the game saving the progress of its use, it made each stage feel more connected to one another. Players would have to save POW uses for particularly dire situations only. Other than this though, the game took place on one unchanging screen. It does use wraparound, which adds an illusion of space to the playing field, but it doesn't patch up the problem of homogeneity that Mario Bros. Suffers from. The lack of variation wasn't an issue in its predecessors. Even Popeye had multiple different stages. Mario Bros. Patched this up with its biggest strength, which lay in how it introduced combat to the franchise. Mario was an adventurer in the past, sure, but now he was given the power to defeat his enemies without the need for a special hammer. It's very likely that Miyamoto and his team drew upon this title when looking for inspiration regarding Super Mario Bros.' combat. It paved the way for Super Mario to experiment with jumping on top of enemies to deal damage, a series staple to this day. Mario Bros. Also marked the debut of Nintendo's friendly and/or competitive 1v1 modes. 2 players could choose to work together, destroy each other's progress, or both. The game gave each player a separate score when levels were completed, which certainly helped to edge on duos. Adding a competitive point counter certainly irked many into sabotaging their partner's game, and there were plenty of ways to sabotage a game. Hitting a platform from below did the same thing to players and enemies. By timing it right, players could knock their opponents into deadly situations. Or they could re-flip a turtle right before their partner kicked it. The possibilities were endless. Other games like Atari's Pong had already introduced the idea of 1v1 play, but there weren't many popular cooperative titles. Fire Truck was perhaps the first instance of a true co-op game, as it let one player steer the front of a bus and the other steer the back, but it didn't provide incentive for a player to harm their friend's progress. Williams' Joust was the first game to give players the option to harm their player to their own benefit. Attacking their friend could net them more points after completing a stage. However, the mode wasn't constrained to any one way of play. Individuals got to decide how they wanted to approach the 2-player modes, competitively or cooperatively. This ambiguity was polished by Mario Bros. While players couldn't directly kill their opponents, they were forced to use more nefarious means. This would become a Nintendo staple of cooperative games from this point forwards. And, speaking of, several mechanics from Mario Bros. Can also be seen in early Nintendo titles. Ice Climber, along with Balloon Fight, included a competitive 2-player versus mode, which gave plenty of chances for players to kill their friends. The jump physics also changed very little between Mario Bros. And Ice Climber, meaning that traversing vertical platforms was just as frustrating. The fireball was also essentially transformed into a polar bear in Ice Climber, which shifted the screen upwards, forcing the player to move faster. This exact fireball also appeared in Wrecking Crew, where it functioned and looked exactly the same. Think of it as a sort of default tool in Nintendo's arsenal, at least during this era. The actual NES version of Mario Bros. Had very few differences from its arcade counterpart. There are some changes in screen resolution, and the sprites are generally less detailed. But outside of this and some sound adjustments, the NES version is a great port. Unfortunately, it didn't perform well enough to really make a name for itself. When Mario Bros. Released in June of 1986, it was already completely outshined by its sequel. In fact, looking up anything regarding the arcade version is quite difficult. Nearly everything done on Mario Bros. Has to do with the Super version. The large majority of people who have played a Mario game have most likely never touched this one. Nintendo has brought it back on every eShop, but it just can't be as iconic as its evolution. Mario Bros. Did see some upgrades as time went on though. Kaiteki ta Mario Bros., a game that launched exclusively on the Famicom Disk System, was more of a remake with commercial advertisements than it was an actual sequel. Peppered throughout standard gameplay were cutaways asking players to mail in info in order to potentially win a prize. It obviously did not see a release in America. Good news though, it did see a direct sequel in the form of Mario Clash on the Virtual Boy. Even though this could be the worst-selling game in the entire Mario franchise due to its exclusive release on the worst-selling Nintendo console of all time, it's actually a pretty fun little game. It takes the basic mechanics of Mario Bros. And puts them in 3D, having players chuck turtle shells at Koopas in the foreground and background in order to defeat them. Overall, it's pretty good. It's just a shame that you can only play it for 15 minutes at a time without developing a headache. The influence of Mario Bros. Is actually quite unique, in that it's likely that people have been exposed to its items and mechanics without even realizing it. The game has been ported and reskinned countless times, including in Mario All-Stars, Mario Advance, and as recently as Super Mario 3D World. The POW block is an iconic item in Mario Kart Wii and the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. Modern-day Wigglers, a Mario enemy that wouldn't get its start until Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, were a sort of spiritual successor to crabs, in that they too speed up when hit once. And we cannot forget the fact that the original featured the debut of Luigi. The two-player mode's influence has become a staple in tons of Nintendo games to this day. New Super Mario Bros. Wii and its sequels have 4-player co-op, but rather than playing as a team, each player could compete with one another for a high score. The same can be said in Super Mario 3D World, which adds a crown to the highest scoring player to encourage violence against them. Outside of Nintendo, these unfriendly cooperative modes, so to speak, can be seen in titles like LEGO Star Wars or even Halo Combat Evolved. You can, of course, just get through the story modes together, or you could become the biggest threat to each other outside of the actual enemies. Mario Bros. Was a fun game that introduced many cornerstones to Nintendo's IPs. It's addictive, intuitive, and influential. Even if it'll never achieve the same fame as Super Mario Bros., it'll remain an iconic part of Nintendo's arcade history, and it was a great port in the black box set.